Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'll continue the series on the Semi-Slav defense with the Anti-Moscow variation or the Anti-Moscow gambit, which is my favorite variation of the Semi-Slav and one of the most exciting variations of the Semi-Slav, along with the Botevnik, which we are going to do tomorrow. If you haven't seen the introductory video on the Semi-Slav, watch it. You will understand the position we have on the board, which is the beginning of the Semi-Slav defense. And now, after black has played the move e6, the Semi-Slav, white has a choice between two most popular moves, e3 or bishop g5. We've been looking at e3 first, the Meran and anti-Meran positions. And then we started going over bishop g5, and we were looking at black's move 5 h6. And in the last video, we looked at bishop takes f6, which is the Moscow variation, which is positional and can be tricky, but it's easier to play than the anti-Moscow, which is bishop h4. And bishop h4 is, when you see this on the board, you know that you are going to have an extremely exciting game full of tactics. It's a gambit, so white is giving up a pawn in exchange for activity, and he has activity. Now, you are exploiting the fact that the e-pawn hasn't moved yet, therefore the c4 pawn is unpre. If we look at the position after bishop g5, black doesn't have to play h6 going for the Moscow or anti-Moscow. Black can take here immediately, and then after e4 we have the Botevnik variation of the Semi-Slav, where, well, if black chooses to defend his pawn, then we get this tricky variation where a lot of stuff is hanging and black ends up being a pawn down, but that's for the next video. And after h6, bishop h4, the situation is slightly different. When black takes on c4 now, and white plays the move e4, black has time to play the move g5, which hasn't been possible before because the h6 pawn was still on h7. And now if we look at this variation, it's different to the Botevnik because white now has to retreat the bishop. And after he retreats the bishop, b5 defends black's extra c4 pawn, and black is simply a pawn up. It's a whole pawn up, but white has compensation. Let me just show you what happens if white blunders, which I have had in a game. So some people who are inexperienced against the Semi-Slav think that this is the Botevnik variation, but it's not. The same sacrifice doesn't work here that you play in the Botevnik, where you manage to regain a piece, because if you take on g5 now, so knight takes g5, h takes g5 is defended by the h-pawn, and after bishop takes, white is not winning the piece back with e5 because black can play the move bishop e7, and now this is simply piece up for black. There is compensation, of course, but black has an extra piece, black has an extra knight, and that's not going away. So that's one common mistake. So after g5, bishop g3 has to be played, and now b5 defending the pawn. We are going to be looking at 4 different moves. For white here, all 4 are tricky. Knight e5 and h4 can transpose. E5 is a variation that the engines don't like, I don't like for white, but it's playable. Hikaru Nakamura has played it. He beat Luke Van Wille with the move e5, and I've recently had it in a training game, which I did manage to win, but I didn't really know what to do against e5 because I've never seen the move before. And we're going to go over that first now. And the main move, of course, is bishop e2, which is the soundest and is supposed to give white the biggest advantage. So the move e5, when you see this on the board, well, you know that black is better. White no longer has compensation for the pawn, and black has to play carefully. Knight d5. If white captures here, that would in fact be a mistake, but it's a mistake that's hard to prove because you now have to play moves like a5, b4, c3 to be able to activate your bishop. Otherwise, your bishop is going to be stuck behind its pawn chain. So I would say that even this is a viable choice for white, because if black doesn't know what he is doing, this bishop could be entombed for the rest of the game. But after knight d5, the most common move is knight d2, which is better. Bishop b7. This is going to be a move that black always plays in the anti-Moscow. You want your bishop on this diagonal because tricks like knight takes b5 often work after queen f3 or bishop e2, bishop f3. Bishop e2 developing, knight d7. This is the second move you always want to play. castles, and now queen b6 reinforcing the queen side and putting pressure on the d4 pawn. Now, the main weakness for black here, well, there are two main weaknesses in the anti-Moscow. The king side, particularly the f7 and the e6 square, and the queen side, b5 and the overextended extra pawn on c4. So very often knight takes b5 and a4 takes b5 is going to work. So the move queen b6 firstly prepares to castle queen side, to defend the king, getting it away from the risky king side, and secondly, it reinforces this structure, so it's a very sensible move. a4. You always meet a4 with a6. In the anti-Moscow, that's a rule you can remember. Knight d to e4, looking at the weak squares in the position, particularly d6. And d6 is going to be a big hole in black's position almost always when the e-pawn has advanced to e5. So this is a protected outpost for white. So a move such as bishop g7 would be a mistake here because the knight can come into d6. Black now castles. Everything is sufficiently defended. Still an extra pawn. Queen d2. Developing the queen, and now c5. Wherever you have the opportunity to play the move c5, play c5. You want to break this bishop free and you want to make it active. A takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes d5. You always want to take with the bishop. You don't want to take with the pawn, allowing the move e6, activating the g3 bishop. And now knight c3, attacking your bishop. Now, retreating the bishop isn't really a good idea. You want to protect it because, as you can see, rook a8 is coming, so knight b8, protecting the bishop, to make sure that once knight takes bishop, you can play rook takes bishop. Bishop f3, another tricky move, giving up a pawn, but going for activity, and now rook takes d4, queen to e2, bishop to g7, finally developing now that the knight cannot get into d6, and rook a8. And in this position, as you can see, white has 5 pawns, black has 7 pawns, but the black king is in a lot of danger. And trust me when I say this, I spent a lot of time trying to make this variation work. It's the best black could get, and it's extremely, extremely hard to play. 4 games have been played from this position. White won all 4 games. The engines give it as plus 0.8 for white. But this bishop is inactive for the moment, which is good. You are going to get your other rook into play. If you can survive the attack, then you have 2 pawns on the queen side, which can become a passed pawn and the queen. So, in theory, this should be good for black if you manage to survive. If you don't, well, then you lose. Okay, the other 2 moves I want to look at before we go to bishop e2 are knight e5 and h4, and they will mainly transpose. So let's look at knight e5 first. Now, there are 3 moves here. h5, I would say, is the main move, and that transposes to h4 and g4, as we are going to see after the first move h4 by white. And that's the best way to play. The other 2 options after knight e5 are bishop b7, which I don't like because it allows h4, and after g4, white can now simply take on g4. So if you, well, after h4, if you don't play g4, then you basically lose. And after g4, if knight takes g4, knight takes g4, queen takes g4 can be played, I really do prefer white. And the main move after knight e5, if you want to play the mainline theory, which is very tricky, is knight b to d7, just giving up your c6 pawn, which I also am not a big fan of. So knight takes c6, queen b6, d5, bishop b7, a4, a6, always play a6 when a4 is played, bishop e2, and now bishop c6, dc6, queen c6. A very tricky position after e5, knight d5, knight d5, queen d5, queen d5, e d5. The bishop pair for white, an extra pawn for black, but definitely not a very solid extra pawn, and I would just prefer to be white here. I think this is very hard to play. So after the move knight e5, if that happens on the board, I would recommend the move h5, and we are going to look at theory in that line in a second, starting with the move h4 for white. So this is transpositional after knight e5 if black plays h5. So after h4, you always have to play g4. now knight e5, and we have the same position, but the difference is we can now play the move h5 and our g4 pawn is defended. And the c6 pawn is defended because the knight is still on b8. Now we are going to be looking at two moves. Here, instead of h5, there was another option, bishop b4, which I'm not a big fan of. If you try bishop b4, that's a very tricky line which ends in huge complications. Bishop e2. Now simply attacking the g4 pawn, but black has played bishop b4 to make sure he could take on e4. And now knight takes e4, castles, bishop takes c3, because your knight was now hanging. B takes c3, and now you play h5, defending your g4 pawn. And in this position, you can see that black has 8 pawns, white has 6 pawns, but there's more than enough compensation. If I turn on the engine, it's equal, slightly better for white, but black is the one who could get in trouble really fast. You haven't developed any of your pieces apart from your knight. White has the very dangerous bishop pair. White's king is safe. It's as safe as it could ever be. And now white goes for an attack. The knight is attacked, so knight takes g3, f takes g3. Now your f7 pawn is hanging, so f5. And this structure is really not solid, and it should be handled with care. a4, a6, queen d2, rook a7, trying to defend laterally. Rook a b1, rook b7, queen e3, queen f6, trying to defend. Bishop c4 is a sacrifice which actually works here, and that's why I don't like the move bishop b4. Now after this, bishop takes c4, b takes c4, of course, rook b7, bishop b7, and now rook b1, attacking your bishop. Rook h7, trying to defend, but now knight takes c4, and white is just winning this position. White is just winning. White is a bishop down for the moment, but if you look at this position, it's +3 for white, and it's basically indefensible. No games have been played from this position. I just wanted to point out that this sacrifice does exist if you meet knight e5 with bishop b4, which I wouldn't recommend. So simply play the move h5. Now white is going to play bishop e2. Here you can play b4, which I don't like, or you can play bishop b7, which is more sensible. If you go for b4, then knight a4, knight takes e4, castles, bishop a6 is very tricky to play, bishop f4. Coming into g5 perhaps, and something like bishop h6 trying to exchange. This could become very, very unpleasant for black, as you can see. So after bishop e2, I would recommend the move bishop b7. Simply defending, trying to hold on to your extra pawn. White castles, knight bd7, queen c2, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, bishop g7 and b3. Normal anti-Moscow territory, cb3, ab3. Black now finally castles. And this is playable. White has a slight advantage here, but black is still holding on to his extra pawn, and he is not in mortal danger, I would say. So I really like this position for black. Bishop g3, c5 finally. It's true that white can take on b5, but then e5 is d4 is hanging. So e5 attacking the knight, knight d5. Now knight takes b5, c takes d4, knight d6, and rook b8. And here you have it, the best position black could hope for after the move knight e5, which is still tricky, but anti-Moscows are always tricky, and you just have to get used to playing this. Of course, rook takes a7 is possible. There are tons of possibilities here for white, and it's not going to be easy to play for black. But it's a normal position in which you definitely have chances. If you are looking for excitement, then this is it. You still have your extra pawn, which is, well, I'm not sure if white can take it immediately. Apparently black equalizes here, but yeah, perhaps white can take it. So knight e5 is a sideline that, in my opinion, should be met with h5, and after bishop e2, bishop b7, going for normal development. And now the main move is bishop e2, not going for h4 or e5 or knight e5, playing the most sensible move and the best move for white. Bishop b7, that's always going to be your first move. Castles, knight bd7, that's always going to be your second move. And now knight e5 coming into the position. And now there are two options for black. One of them is better. One of them is also more complicated. You can either play bishop g7, fianchettoing your bishop and preparing to castle, sort of, or you can play the move h5. After the move h5, white takes on d7, queen takes d7, and queen c1, putting pressure on g5 and rook g8. You're just not going to castle as black. You're going to play in the center, and that much is clear. Your king is going to be stuck on e8 or on e7, but that's just something you have to accept. And I think this is very hard to play unless you have tons of experience in these lines after h5, so I wouldn't recommend that. After the move knight e5, I would recommend the move bishop g7. And now we come to a huge crossroads. We are going to look at the main line, and we are going to look at a novelty introduced by Veselin Topalov in a game against Vladimir Kramnik, a sacrifice on f7, which is mental completely. So let's look at the main move first. So knight takes d7 is the best move according to the engines and according to theory. Knight takes d7, bishop d6, this bishop is very annoying, a6, solidifying this structure, a4, b4, the bishop cannot take on c4 because the knight is attacked, but the bishop does take on b4. I'm sorry, the bishop cannot take on c4 because the knight is attacked, but the bishop can take on b4. And now after bishop takes b4, you have this tricky move queen b6, where you are attacking the d4 pawn and the b4 bishop. So once the bishop retreats to a3, you're going to take on d4, and after queen c2 declining the trade, you play the move c5, blunting this bishop finally, and now of course rook ad1, and you retreat the queen to e5. And this position is slightly better for black. In reality it's equal number of pawns after bishop takes c4 is played, and both sides have chances here. Black doesn't have such a terminally weak king here, but he has a slightly worse pawn structure. On the other hand, he has very good bishops. White's light squared bishop is slightly planted. You cannot castle yet because your knight is unpre, but you can play something like queen c7, and after something like knight e2, the position is fine. From this position on, there have still been 85 games, believe it or not, with the move bishop e5. There is a lot more theory, 15 more moves of theory, and 94% of the games end in a draw if both sides know what they are doing. That is why now we are going to look at Topalov's attempt to avoid this drawing variation on the highest level by taking on f7. And once knight takes f7 happens on the board and you haven't seen it before, then you are spending half an hour. I mean, it's obvious that you have to take the knight, that much is clear, otherwise you just lose. But after e5, knight d5, knight e4, now you are spending half an hour. And it's clear that white has compensation for the piece. His threat is now knight d6 winning the bishop, so you have to react. King e7 is played to get out of the way, and now we are going to look at a long theoretical line which has been worked out since the first game, Topalov Kramnik. And this is something you just have to know if you play the Semi-Slav, because it's unavoidable. If white plays the Anti-Moscow and he plays the main line, he can just take on f7, and it would be embarrassing to lose a game because you didn't learn 10 moves of theory. There are example games. I'm just going to name a few. So Topalov Kramnik 2008. You can look at Jan Timan Ljubojevic from 2008, which was, I think, played the very next day after this game. And then there is Nekaev versus Zak and Bubir versus Nobel Mark. Those 4 games are, I would say, the best examples. Topalov did defeat Kramnik with this sacrifice, so you should look at that. So here we are looking at a long forced line. Knight d6 has to be played. Queen b6 defending the bishop has to be played. Bishop g4, a very tricky move, putting pressure on e6, is the best move. Rook a to f8, solidifying the king side. Queen to c2, preparing to enter the g6 square with a lot of threats. Rook h to g8, trying to defend g6 indirectly. Rook a d1, and now c5. You have to play c5, because otherwise your bishop is dead. But now queen g6. Knight c7, defending the e6 square. This is also a must-play move. And now knight takes b7. If you haven't seen this variation, then you are spending another half an hour after knight takes b7. And it's better that you learn it here. So if you take the knight, you lose on the spot. Queen takes b7, just d5, and your game is busted. Queen b6 is the best move, and now just d6 check, king d8, pawn takes knight, king takes knight, and this is unbearable. This is +9 or +10 for white, so unplayable. So after the move knight takes b7, you just have to be happy to be giving the piece back and releasing some of this, the pressure from the position. cd4. Now, of course, the knight is unpre, because if queen takes b7, there is no d5. So queen e4 defending, knight d5 attacking the knight once again, and now knight d6. And now there are a couple of moves. The best one is d3, in my opinion. Bishop takes e5 has also been played. You can play that because the knight is hanging at the end of the line. So here, bishop takes e5. Knight takes e5, queen takes e5, queen takes d6. This might be a smarter practical decision, trying to defend. And now if you look at this position, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, black is still a pawn up, has a knight for the bishop. The knight is, in my opinion, better than the bishop, but it's still extremely hard to play. Okay, so this is, I'm hoping this is going to be named the Topalov Gambit or the Topalov Sacrifice or something like that. This knight takes f7 idea, this you have to learn. So just to give you a quick recap of the opening, after e6, the semi-Slav, bishop g5 is the most aggressive move. After h6, we can enter the Moscow, or we can enter the anti-Moscow with bishop h4. And now black has to take the pawn. e4, threatening e5, but now g5. Once again, this is not the Botevnik, so this just loses a piece. Okay, so after g5, white has to retreat the bishop, and black now defends his extra pawn. Here, white can play the move bishop e2, which is the main move, or 3 sidelines, h4, e5, or knight e5. You have to know all of them. h4 and knight e5 transpose, in my opinion, because I choose the same variation against both. And yeah, I enjoy playing this variation. I mean, it's really enjoyable to play. Your games are going to be nerve-wracking, and you have to know a lot of theory, and you have to have tactical prowess on a really high level to survive. But it's good for your chess. Playing this is great for your chess, I think. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Tomorrow we are continuing with the Botevnik Semi-Slav, which is going to be the last video in the series. Also, even more aggressive than this, but less variations to learn. Thanks, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.